Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Frédéric Gillion. I'm a partner at Pilzer Masons and I specialize in construction disputes and arbitration. If you want to, maybe conscious of time, if you want to move to slide 4, what we're going to try now is just to concentrate on a couple of issues. We've heard today about the obligation of the contractor to comply with instructions, instructed variations, and what we'd like to explore now with you is the possibility that maybe the contractor does not want to perform these variations. And what we're going to try to see is whether he can object to an instructed variation, in what circumstances, what would he refuse. But I think if we were to look broadly at international construction contracts, I think the most of contracts we encounter, whether it's FIDIC, NEC, all the other maybe bespoke forms of contract that we encounter, they all have fairly detailed provisions dealing with variations. All of them tend to have or give a wide range of powers to the employer to vary the works. And that's what we heard, not a bad thing. It gives flexibility to the contract. But you would find sometimes typical restrictions on the ability of the employer to unilaterally change the contract. And we heard this morning and this afternoon again, the distinction between making a variation under the contract and changing the contract. Also, typical restrictions would be on the ability of the engineer to omit work to give it to somebody else. And that's again a point that Didier mentioned today. And specifically on the FIDIC Pink Book, you also have some restrictions in terms of the approvals to be required from the employer when there's an instruction variations. If you want to move to the second, next slide. Oh, I do it. That's absolutely fine. You may want to ask yourself, why would a contractor refuse to perform a variation? Well, there may be various reasons. One would be the fact that the variations would require resources to be staying on site for longer and may not have the resources to be deployed for another 6 months or a year. He may have another project line up, maybe more profitable, so it may not make sense for him to do this extra work. Maybe that's another point that Sebastian mentioned earlier about the tender. The tender may have rates that actually are not adequate for the extra work that is being instructed, in which case it may have concern about its margin for the additional work. There may be issues with the risk associated with the change work, the instructions in terms of the impact on performance guarantees. And the final point, there may be a lack of expertise for the additional work that is being instructed. And I've got currently a case. It's a dam project. The contractor has been asked to build a plunge pool. So he has to build a cofferdam and pump the water out from the plunge pool to consolidate the bottom of the dam. And halfway through the construction, the employer decided to go 30 meters deeper because the initial design was inadequate. But that represented a high risk, both in terms of all the elements here, but ultimately it didn't have sufficient expertise to do this extra work, which was we required special enforcement expertise, which it didn't have. So the question then is, can I object to the performance of this instruction? Now we're going to look at a couple of contracts. I'm going to start with FIDIC. And when I talk about concerns about some of the rates that may be contained in the contract and the price of the variation, we all think about FIDIC, say, well, you have to do the works and then argue later about the price. Tends to be the position on the most FIDIC forms. But on the FIDIC Blue Book, if you have, and this is the second paragraph, an instruction that required mobilization of major dredging equipment, and the Blue Book, for those of you who don't know it, it's about dredging and reclamation work. So major work that require usually equipment such as very large barges, and these barges tend to be booked probably 1, 2, 3 years in advance. And when you are a dredging contractor, you know that your very specialist equipment will be used next month on another project. So if you have an instruction to stay on site for longer for another month, well, that means that you're going to be late on the other project. So then if there was an ability to delay the mobilization of that barge, then you want to make sure that the cost of that postponement will be taken into account before you carry on these additional works. So that's an exception in a way. I've seen some projects as well where these provisions were included, and I have to say, well done to the contractor who managed to get it agreed, because most of the time what we have is obviously the fact that the contractor will not be able to negotiate or to object pending the agreement on price. He will have to perform the variation. Sorry, I don't know why there's this line on top, but what you have on the FIDIC, on the other hand, is the ability to object to certain variations. And what I'd like to do and pause for 5 minutes is what grounds on which you can rely as a contractor to object to the performance of additional work. So you get here an extract from 30.1 of the Yellow Book. So you can see you can object if the contractor can't readily obtain the goods required for the variation, whether it affects the stability, safety or suitability of the works. And finally, it will have an adverse impact on the achievement of the schedule of guarantees. That's the 99 edition, which you find in other books. What I'd like you to look at is the 2017 edition, which has drastically changed the ability for the contractor to object to the performance of an instructed variation. I'd like to pause on two grounds here, A and E. And starting with E, you will see that if the contractor is instructed to perform a variation, he's bound by it, unless the contractor promptly gives a notice to the engineer stating that that instruction may adversely affect the contractor's obligation to complete the works so that they shall be fit for the purpose for which they are intended under subclause 4.1. 4.1 defines the obligation of fitness or purpose on the Yellow Book for the 2017 edition. What it does require is the contractors to perform the work so that they are fit for the purpose as they are intended in the employer's requirements. That's important, in the employer's requirements. Which means what? If you have a variation which arguably is a result of a change in the employer's requirements, then the contractor is able to object to the instruction being given, which you will think is affecting or is giving a big bargaining power for the contractor to negotiate a price, for example, or the conditions for performance of this additional work. And the second ground on which I wanted to touch base is A, even more puzzling. What it states here is that the contractor may object to an instruction to vary the works if the very works was unforeseeable, and you get a definition at the bottom. Unforeseeable is not reasonably foreseeable by an experienced contractor, having regard to the scope and nature of the works described in the employer's requirements. And if you want to pause for 5 seconds, I know we're running out of time, but if you look at this, it's puzzling. Why is it so? It's because most of the time, by definition, a variation is something that is unforeseen. Otherwise, it will be put in the employer's requirements. So you are, and I think I did ask the question to, during one of the conferences to Chris Sepala, who was one of the person who was consultant, so what do you mean by that? Because to me, it means that the contractor can pretty much object to every single variation being instructed because it will be unforeseeable. And what was meant there is actually what I try to explain very briefly on the next slide, which is this concept of cardinal change. If something has been instructed that really shows an extensive amount of work beyond what is provided for as your original scope of work, or whether it's something that is completely changing the nature of the works that is being performed, then there's the US concept of cardinal change, which I'm sure one of our American colleagues will be familiar with, which you will find in a different way in different jurisdictions. English law does not have cardinal change, but there's some case law that basically says if you are instructed to do works that are so unexpected, so different from what was envisaged in the contract, then it's not something that you can instruct within the framework of the contract. It has to be the subject of a separate contract with separate terms of payment and a separate price. And you have the similar concept on the French law and other civil law jurisdictions with the concept, I may be corrected there. There's maybe something on the Vietnamese law that may be similar, but you find it in many civil law jurisdictions, the concept of unforeseeable change of circumstances that affect the economic balance of the contract. comes back from public works on the administrative contract a long time ago, and this has now been imported in the French civil code. And you find that in many other civil law jurisdictions. I'm not going to go into details, but it does actually recognize that in circumstances where there are radical changes to the works, because there's been, for example, additional works being instructed or different conditions, then you're entitled as a contractor to be compensated for this additional cost. I'm not going to go too much in detail because I think it's just an illustration of where under English law you have a separate contract as opposed to a variation. There was a dredging works. Imagining a pontoon and some dredging works by the lake. The employer said, well, it's very good to use that dredge material. How about we build an island in the middle of the lake? And said, well, it's not really my skill. It's not what you asked me to do. You asked me to build a pontoon and to take out the dredge material. Now you're asking me to build an island. That's something radically different. And the judge in that case, you will find it in different jurisdictions, will say, well, actually, it's a different contract altogether. And on this case, the compensation would be the evaluation of the additional works would be on the basis of what we heard today, this afternoon, quantum myriad, which would be original price. I think that's it for that first issue. I mean, how much time have we got? Because I don't want to be...
Certainly, well, I would suggest the topic of price adjustment and valuation came up quite significantly.
Valuation, okay. I think, summarize, I don't know if anyone wants to jump in on valuation, which is, again, a cause of dispute all the time, which is, do you value your variation or the variation on the basis of the rates, new rates, or actual cost? And I don't know if you want to share any war stories about this, because to me, it's someone mentioned variation as being something that keeps you busy every day, but that's the same for me. And that debate about variation on the basis of rates of cost is something that I do every day.
But anyway, when you look at it, it is much more sophisticated than that, because when you start discussing rates, then you might have first to look at whether there is an appropriate rate, whether there is a similar rate, and so you stay in the systems quite some time before you may ever come to the point, now I deviated, go for cost plus, is a kind of default rule. It's not very, very, very balanced. It's not very fair because it's also not very systematic, but it's what the English have developed, and it makes, to some extent, sense.
Yeah, what's interesting is that we talk about variation in the context of additional works, but I can tell you, talk about international construction contracts in other jurisdictions. In North Africa, for example, variations will be the term used for every kind of claim, every adjustment to the contract. So if you have a claim for prolongation costs resulting from all kinds of things, which have nothing to do with additional works, by the way, this will be framed as a variation. That comes from the sort of the culture, I suppose, where you don't want to make a claim per se, you will make, a variation, and you will agree on terms for variations. And that is why I think this is becoming more relevant, because when it comes to prolongation cost claims, you might think, well, it's going to be a breach of contract. Actual cost should be the rule in terms of valuation of prolongation cost. But no, actually, in North Africa, most of the time, it's valued on the basis of rates. And you would have rates in the contract dealing with whether it's a day work rates or in Africa as well. I mean, I'm currently involved in some projects funded by the EU, and you have rates in the BOQ dealing with prolongation costs, time-related costs on a monthly basis.
In the new Green Book as well, there is an interesting, so the FIDI Green Book is a short form of contract, and in this new Green Book, there is an interesting provision to value the prolongation cost, and there is a kind of formula which is proposed just to simplify and to spare the hassle of having some claim experts, and so there is in the contract, in the general condition, a formula to assess prolongation costs. So it depends on the time when the claim is made. So whether or not, if my memory is correct, the claim is made during the first half, the first 35% or the second 35% or the last stretch of the contract. There is the formula, the parameters will be different. There's a calculation of the overall estimate of the overheads, and therefore there will be a calculation of the daily overheads. And considering the time when the claim is made, using this daily assessment of the overheads, there will be, and considering the duration of the prolongation cost, there will be a formula which will give, I would say, so to speak, automatically an amount of prolongation cost. So an interesting feature.
Just probably one point in terms of legislation, the German legislator has some 4 years ago, adopted this system of cost plus for variations, for real variations, as a kind of default rule. That's the first thing. The second thing, however, is if you, and it shows and demonstrates how tricky it is, if you omit an item and you have a BOQ rate which is low, and then you omit this item and the rate will not apply. Now you extract something new, go for cost plus, the contractor makes real benefit.
You were exactly stealing my point about omissions, because when we deal with variations based on rates, very often I'd say, I don't want to say side, but the employers will say, well, it's too high. These rates are too high. They don't reflect actual cost. Well, those rates apply to both parties. If you were to omit some works, you would omit works on the basis of the same rate. So if they're too high, then it would benefit you as well. So I think that the idea of having rates to value variations, including prolongation costs, I think is very good, because a very large part of the dispute relating to variations comes to that. Whether it's a variation or not, but ultimately it's all about money. So it's all about how much do I pay for this extra works. If we were to agree on rates and the time impact, time-related cost, then you would have a lot of this dispute that would actually go away.
Well, frequently you can also really save costs. Under Red Book, for instance, an engineer could sometimes, under 412, just instruct a variation using very low rates and interpolate the new rates from them, while under normally 412 you have to pay cost, which could be even higher than including profit of the rate. So you can play games, right?
Could I just call you out on that? As you've used a term that you used during your presentation, intrapolation, extrapolation. Would you be able to distinguish that for our audience who might not have English as a first language?
Similar rates, and you may derive easily from one of those a kind of a new rate by looking just of the developments, or extrapolate. You will have to go and to compare the various matters in order to then come to a conclusion based on broader data. It's just slightly different approach to the same matter. Basically, you derive a new one from the old one.
And I'm just conscious of the time. I think we need to wrap up. But I think the final point was about, I think, and that's something that has been covered before, the payment of the variations. And one of the issues that we face in Vietnam and other jurisdictions, the fact that very often there's a need for the employer to have a contract amendment in place before payment is made, not unique to Vietnam, be assured. And that creates difficulties in a way of financing the varied works. I mean, you mentioned, I think, 18 months before a contract amendment is signed. I can tell you in Nigeria, it's about 3 or 4 years before you actually get your contract amendment, and therefore you can actually get paid. And on really large, oil and gas project, you're looking at a shortfall of something between 50 to 100 million every year of shortfall of cash for the contractor. And then there was another point this morning about what would you do? Well, what would you do? You would make a claim for the shortfall, and that would be typically the financing charges you would actually claim for the shortfall of cash for 3 or 4 years. But obviously, it's not the ideal solution. Solution would be obviously that there would not be the need for a contract amendment for the payment of variations under the contract, or if there's one, obviously it should be done in a much shorter period.
Well, that's certainly been one of the most dynamic